I said it the way I said most things to Sable, half joking, testing the water without any real expectation of it, landing anywhere serious. We were sitting in our usual booth at the diner near the truck depot, the same corner table we'd claimed for the better part of 6 years, worn vinyl seats and a coffee pot that never seemed to run empty. And I'd just finished telling her about the cross-country haul I was leaving on at dawn. 2,300 miles, I told her, sliding my route printout across the table. Denver. Then out toward the coast, back through the mountains on the return leg. A full week, easy. Sounds exhausting. You should come, I said, mostly kidding, stirring my coffee. A week on the road. See the country from the cab of an 18-wheeler. I'll even let you pick the music for at least half the drive. Sable looked up from her own coffee, something unreadable moving behind her expression. You're serious? I don't know. Are you asking because you're actually considering it or because you think I'm bluffing? I don't know either, honestly. Ask me again in the morning. I leave at dawn, Sable. There's no time to ask again. Then I guess we'll both find out what I actually decide, won't we? I laughed it off, the way we laughed off most things that skirted too close to something real, and we finished our usual dinner and said our usual goodbyes. And I told myself, driving home that night, that the conversation had been exactly what it sounded like. A joke. Nothing more. The kind of thing you say to fill a comfortable silence with two people who'd spent 6 years dancing carefully around whatever sat underneath their friendship. I'm Roman Kestrel, 35. I've driven long-haul freight for 12 years, crisscrossing the country in week-long and month-long stretches that had, over time, made stability considerably harder to build than most people managed. Sable Vance has been my best friend for 6 of those years, ever since she started working the counter at that same diner during a rough patch in her own life. And we'd built an entire friendship around exactly the kind of comfortable, low-stakes intimacy that survives well as long as neither person examines it too closely. I remember the day we met clearly. I'd been a regular at that diner for years by then. The specific, reliable rhythm of stopping there every time my route brought me through, and Sable had started 3 weeks earlier, still learning the regulars' orders, still adjusting to a job she'd taken mostly out of necessity after a difficult stretch that included both a breakup and a layoff in the same month. We started talking, initially just the ordinary small talk of a regular and a new server, and somehow that small talk had accumulated, over months and then years, into something considerably more substantial than either of us had planned on. I arrived at the depot before dawn the next morning, running through my pre-trip checklist with the specific muscle memory of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, and nearly dropped my clipboard when I saw Sable standing beside my truck, a single duffel bag over her shoulder, dressed for a week on the road. I stood there for a second, genuinely uncertain whether I was seeing things after too little sleep, before she spoke and confirmed she was, in fact, real. "Are you going to let me stand out here?" she said. "Or can I actually get in before you leave without me?" "You're serious. You're actually coming. I told you to ask me again in the morning. This is me answering." She hitched the duffel bag higher on her shoulder, something both nervous and determined in her expression. "I'm ready, Roman, if the offer's still standing. What made you decide? Overnight, I mean, you seemed genuinely uncertain last night." I spent most of the night lying awake, running through every reasonable objection I could think of, and every single one of them felt smaller than the specific fear of watching you drive off this morning and always wondering what would have happened if I'd just said yes. She shrugged, a small, self-deprecating gesture. So, here I am. Slightly sleep-deprived, entirely unprepared for truck driving logistics, but here. I wanted on the record that I hesitated for exactly 1 second before saying yes, mostly because the specific weight of what she was actually agreeing to hadn't fully hit me yet, standing there in the pre-dawn dark with a woman I'd spent 6 years carefully not examining my feelings for. "Get in," I said. "We've got a lot of miles ahead of us." My company allowed registered ride-along passengers as long as the paperwork was filed before departure, and I'd texted dispatch the second I got over my own shock, clearing Sable's information while she waited by the truck. She filled out the waiver before sunrise with hands that only shook a little, signing her name on a clipboard I usually only handed to safety inspectors. She climbed into the cab with the specific, slightly overwhelmed energy of someone committing to something considerably bigger than a simple road trip, and I helped her stow her bag before pulling out of the depot into the still dark morning, both of us quiet for the first several miles, letting the enormity of the decision settle in gradually rather than all at once. Here's what you need to know about Sable Vance before anything else happens. She's 32, works as a freelance graphic designer now, flexible enough with her schedule that a week away from her usual routine wasn't the logistical nightmare it might have been for most people. She'd dated someone seriously about 3 years earlier, a relationship that had ended, according to what she'd told me in fragments over the years, because her ex had never been able to handle the specific unpredictability of her freelance schedule, the odd hours and last-minute deadlines that came with the work she genuinely loved. I didn't fully understand, that first morning, that her history carried more relevant weight than I'd initially appreciated, that a week in a truck cab with a man whose entire career was built on exactly the kind of constant motion that had ended her last relationship might be testing something considerably more significant than either of us had named out loud yet. The first few hours on the road passed easily, both of us falling into the comfortable rhythm we'd built over 6 years of diner conversations, just relocated to a considerably smaller, more mobile space. Sable took her promised half of the music selection seriously, subjecting me to a playlist that ranged from surprisingly good to genuinely questionable. And we talked easily about everything and nothing, the specific unhurried conversation that comes naturally to two people who already know each other well. "This is a genuinely terrible song," I told her, somewhere around hour 2, as something with an aggressive amount of synthesizer filled the cab. "This is a masterpiece and you have no taste. I stand by every song on this playlist. I'm reconsidering the 50-50 music arrangement." "Too late, you already agreed. No renegotiating terms once we're already on the road." "Can I ask you something?" Sable said somewhere around hour 4, watching the landscape scroll past. "Why'd you actually ask me? Last night, I mean. Was it really just a joke that got out of hand, or was there something more deliberate behind it? I want to be honest about how I answered that question, because it matters for the rest of this story. I think I've been testing that particular water for longer than I want to admit," I said. 6 years of half-jokes that never quite committed to being real questions. I think some part of me has always wondered what it would actually be like to have you along for one of these hauls, and last night I just finally said it out loud instead of keeping it in my head. That's a very honest answer for a man who usually deflects with humor. I contain multitudes. Occasionally one of them involves genuine honesty at inconvenient moments. She was quiet for a moment, processing that. "I need you to know something before this week goes any further. I dated someone once who couldn't handle the unpredictability of my work schedule. It ended badly, mostly because he made me feel like my career was an inconvenience he was tolerating rather than something he actually respected. I don't want to spend a week finding out you feel the same way about a life built entirely around constant motion, only with the roles reversed. That's a fair thing to worry about. I don't have a clean promise to offer beyond telling you I've spent 12 years building a life I genuinely love around this exact unpredictability, and I'd never ask anyone to see that as an inconvenience rather than something worth respecting. I appreciate that. I still might need the week to actually believe it, rather than just take your word for it." "That's fair too. Let's just see how the week actually goes rather than deciding anything in advance." We fell into an easy rhythm over the following days. Long stretches of highway conversation, comfortable silences that never felt awkward, meals at truck stops and roadside diners that became their own small tradition. Our first night, we stopped at a diner just outside the state line, tired and hungry, and something about that particular meal, greasy, unglamorous, exactly the kind of place neither of us would have chosen for a first date under normal circumstances, became a fixture we returned to deliberately on subsequent trips, a specific marker of the night. everything between us actually started shifting. The diner itself was nothing remarkable. Fluorescent lighting, cracked vinyl booths, a menu that hadn't changed in probably 2 decades. But there was something disarming about the specific ordinariness of it, both of us too exhausted from the day's driving to perform anything beyond genuine tiredness and genuine hunger. "This is objectively terrible coffee," Sable said that first night, grimacing at her cup. "It's truck stop coffee. It's not supposed to be good. It's supposed to keep you awake through hour 14 of a drive." I respect its commitment to that singular purpose, even as I question every choice that led me to drinking it voluntarily. We ordered breakfast for dinner, the specific comfort food that trucker diners specialize in, and talked for nearly 2 hours past when our food arrived, both of us slower to leave than the meal itself required. "I could get used to this," Sable admitted, somewhere in that stretch. "The rhythm of it. I expected to hate the actual driving portion of this trip, honestly, and instead I think I'm finding it strangely peaceful. Most people either love it or hate it within the first day, not much middle ground. I think I'm surprising myself by landing on love, at least so far. Ask me again after day 5, when the novelty's worn off." By day 3, something had clearly shifted between us. The careful, comfortable friendship, gradually giving way to something neither of us had fully named yet, but both of us were clearly aware of. Small moments accumulated, her hand resting briefly on my arm during a story. A lingering look held a beat too long, the specific charged quiet that settles between two people circling something real. Everything changed on day 4 somewhere in the mountains, when a sudden, violent storm combined with a mechanical failure in the truck's brake system to turn an ordinary driving day into a genuinely dangerous situation. The sky had darkened fast, the specific mountain weather shift that gives almost no warning, rain turning to something closer to sleet within 20 minutes, visibility dropping to almost nothing on a grade steep enough that I was already working the brakes harder than I liked. The warning light came on without much notice, a dashboard indicator I'd seen plenty of times before, but never in combination with weather this bad, on a grade this unforgiving. I felt the brakes respond sluggishly, considerably less reliable than they should have been, and spent several of the longest minutes of my professional driving career working the truck down through a series of switchbacks with gradually diminishing confidence in my ability to actually stop it if I needed to. "Roman." Sable's voice was tight, controlled, the specific fear of someone smart enough to recognize danger without needing it explained. "What's happening?" "Brakes are underperforming. I need you to stay calm and let me focus. I'm going to get us somewhere safe." I managed to get the truck safely pulled over onto a wide shoulder about 2 miles further down, hands shaking with adrenaline once I'd finally brought us to a full stop, both of us sitting in stunned silence once the immediate danger had passed. The rain continued hammering the windshield, the cab suddenly feeling considerably smaller than it had all week. "That was genuinely terrifying," Sable said, voice unsteady. "Is this normal? Does this happen often?" "Not often, no. Mechanical failures happen occasionally. Bad weather happens more often. Both at once, with a grade like that, was about as bad as this job gets." I shook my head, still working through my own disbelief. The truck passed a full inspection before we ever left the depot. That's the worst part, honestly. Sometimes the road still finds the one thing your checklist didn't catch. "How do you do this for a living? Live with that kind of risk as just an ordinary Tuesday?" I felt the weight of her question settle heavily, understanding immediately that we'd arrived at exactly the reckoning her ex-relationship history had warned me was coming. "I don't know if I have a good answer. I've made peace with the risk because the alternative, a stationary life that never particularly suited me, felt like its own kind of danger, just slower and less visible. I don't expect everyone to make that same peace, though. That's a genuinely fair thing to need to examine before committing to anyone who lives this way. I'm scared, Roman, not just of the storm or the mechanical failure. I'm scared this is exactly the pattern that broke my last relationship, and I don't know if I actually have it in me to build something with someone whose entire life runs on this kind of unpredictable risk. I called for roadside assistance, and we waited nearly 2 hours for a tow to reach us on that isolated stretch of mountain road, the storm gradually softening into steady, ordinary rain by the time help finally arrived. We spent those 2 hours in a strange, charged quiet, both of us processing the scare in our own ways, neither quite ready to push the earlier conversation further until we'd had space to actually breathe. We spent that evening at a roadside motel, waiting for a repair truck, both of us sitting with a conversation neither of us wanted to rush through. I want to be honest about how carefully I navigated it, because it mattered enormously for the integrity of whatever we were actually building. We got separate rooms at the motel, a detail neither of us discussed but both of us understood without needing to say it out loud, and neither of us was ready to actually sleep once we'd checked in. So we ended up back outside, sitting at a small table by the vending machines near the office. The vending machine area was exactly what you'd expect from a place built to serve stranded truckers. A flickering overhead light, a soda machine that rattled loudly enough to fill the silences. Neither of us knew how to fill ourselves. Plastic chairs that had seen better decades. We ordered pizza from the only delivery option the small town offered and sat across from each other at that small round table, both of us still processing the day's fear in our own separate ways. I don't want to convince you of anything you're not genuinely ready to choose, I told her. If this lifestyle isn't something you can build a life around, I'd rather know that now than have you resent it later, the way it sounds like your ex eventually did. I don't think it's the lifestyle itself I'm scared of, actually. I think it's whether I can trust someone to actually want me along for it, instead of just tolerating me being there. My ex made me feel like an inconvenience to his real life. I need to know this wouldn't become that. You've never once felt like an inconvenience this entire trip. If anything, I've spent 4 days remembering exactly why 6 years of half-jokes never quite worked as a substitute for actually asking you properly. Why didn't you ask properly all those years? Before last night, I mean. I considered the question seriously, wanting to give her an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. I think I was scared of exactly this conversation, actually. Scared that if I asked directly and you said no, I'd lose the easy version of us I already had. The joke version let me keep testing the water without ever risking the actual fall. That's a very honest admission. I've apparently run out of energy to keep performing anything less than honest. 4 days and 1 brake failure into this particular trip. Sable reached for my hand, something steadying finally settling into her expression. I think I needed the storm, honestly. Not because I wanted anything dangerous to happen, but because it forced the actual reckoning instead of just the easy, comfortable version of this week. What's the reckoning telling you? That I want to try. Genuinely, not just for the rest of this trip, but for whatever comes after it too. The kiss that followed started careful, the specific careful of 2 people who'd just weathered something genuinely frightening together, and understood exactly how much trust that required. Then it went warm, her hand finding the front of my jacket with a certainty that erased whatever remaining hesitation either of us carried, and then, for one long, unhurried moment, it went past warm entirely, into something that made a flickering vending machine alcove feel like exactly the right place for 6 years of careful, almost to finally resolve itself. We broke apart to the sound of the repair truck pulling into the lot outside, entirely unbothered by either of us. Both of us laughing at the practical interruption to a genuinely significant moment. For the record, I said, I'm glad we made it through that storm together. Terrible way to learn the truth, but I'm glad it was with you. I'm choosing to interpret that as romantic instead of concerning. The repair took most of the following morning, both of us waiting at the small mountain town's only mechanic shop, considerably more relaxed than we'd been the previous evening. The specific easy comfort of 2 people who'd finally said the thing they'd both been circling for years. We spent that waiting time walking through the tiny town's single main street, browsing a used bookstore neither of us needed anything from, sharing a genuinely terrible cup of gas station coffee that somehow tasted better than it had any right to, given the company. This town has exactly one traffic light, Sable observed, studying the modest downtown with visible amusement. I don't think I've ever been somewhere this small. Welcome to long-haul trucking. Half my job is discovering towns exactly like this one, usually under circumstances considerably less pleasant than a broken-down brake system. I could get used to discovering them like this, though. Silver linings, apparently, come in unexpected packaging. We finished the haul together, the remaining 3 days carrying an entirely different energy than the uncertain first 4. Steadier, more certain. Both of us building something real out of what had started as a half-serious joke over diner coffee. The delivery itself, when we finally reached it, felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had led up to it. A straightforward warehouse drop-off that neither of us had much emotional investment in beyond it, marking the technical end of the working portion of our trip. "That's it?" Sable asked, watching the warehouse crew unload the trailer with brisk efficiency. "After everything, the actual delivery is just paperwork and a signature?" "Most of the job is exactly that unglamorous, honestly. The interesting parts are everything that happens between pickup and delivery, not the delivery itself. I think I understand that principle considerably better than I did a week ago, in more ways than one." We stopped at that same first diner on the return trip, deliberately. Both of us understanding it had already become something more than just an ordinary meal. "Same table," Sable said, sliding into the booth. "Same terrible coffee." Some traditions are worth keeping, apparently, even the objectively bad ones. I've decided the coffee's part of the charm at this point. I'm rewriting my own personal history to make that true, regardless of the coffee's actual quality. The final 2 days before we reached the depot settled into something quieter and steadier than the earlier tension had allowed for. Long, comfortable conversations about what an actual relationship might look like around 2 unpredictable schedules. Careful, deliberate planning for how we'd handle the practical logistics of dating a truck driver whose job kept him away for stretches at a time. "I don't need you home every night," Sable told me somewhere on day 6, watching the mile markers pass. "I just need to know that when you are home, I'm actually the priority, not an afterthought squeezed in around everything else." "You will be. I've had 6 years of practice treating you like a priority already, honestly. This just makes it official, instead of something I was quietly doing without a label attached." I noticed that, actually, more than you probably realized, the way you always remembered my coffee order without asking, the way you'd text updates from the road, even when we weren't anything more than friends yet. I think some part of me always knew you were already treating this like something more serious than either of us was naming. Guilty as charged. I suppose the joke was really just permission for both of us to finally say the quiet part out loud. We drove the final stretch back to the depot mostly in comfortable silence, both of us processing the week's enormous shift in our own ways, the specific quiet of 2 people who understood that something significant had happened without needing to keep narrating it out loud. When we finally pulled back into the depot, exactly 7 days after we'd left, both of us sat in the cab for a long moment before either of us moved to get out. "So," Sable said, "what happens now?" "Now I think we figure out what a relationship actually looks like, outside the specific compressed intensity of a week on the road. Slower, probably. More ordinary, in the best possible way." I like that plan. I think I've had enough compressed intensity for 1 week, honestly, even the good kind. My old dispatcher continued weighing in periodically over the following months, apparently invested in the outcome of a relationship he'd watched develop mostly through my own increasingly distracted radio check-ins. "You've got a different energy on the road lately," he told me, a few weeks after we returned from that first trip together. "Less of the usual grumbling about long stretches. More of you actually looking forward to the destination for once." I contain multitudes, apparently, including a newly discovered appreciation for long stretches of highway. Don't get sentimental on me, Kestrel. I still need you hitting your delivery windows regardless of how many multitudes you're currently discovering. Noted. I'll balance sentiment and professionalism accordingly. We didn't rush anything after that trip. Sable kept her freelance career, occasionally joining me for shorter hauls when her schedule allowed, both of us building a relationship that honored the specific unpredictability of both our working lives instead of asking either of us to abandon it. We settled into a rhythm neither of us had expected to find so naturally, her working remotely during rest breaks and overnight stops, video calls with clients conducted from truck stops and parked rest areas with surprisingly reliable Wi-Fi, both of us discovering that two unpredictable careers could actually complement each other rather than compete. I never expected to actually enjoy client calls from a Flying J parking lot, she admitted, about 4 months in, closing her laptop after a particularly good pitch meeting conducted from the passenger seat. But there's something oddly freeing about it. No office politics, no commute, just the work itself. I told you the lifestyle had upsides beyond terrible coffee. The coffee's still terrible. I stand by that assessment unconditionally. A year later, we got married, the ceremony held, appropriately, at a small venue near the truck depot where this entire story had actually started. My old dispatcher, who'd known me for the better part of a decade, gave a toast that mostly consisted of teasing me for taking 6 years to work up the nerve to ask Sable anything more serious than her lunch order. I watched this man drive 2,000 miles without hesitation more times than I can count, he said, raising his glass. And it took him 6 years to drive 2,000 miles with the nerve to actually ask this woman a real question. Some kinds of courage take longer to build than others, apparently. Sable's mother, meeting me properly for the first time at the rehearsal dinner, pulled me aside with visible relief. I worried, after her last relationship, that she'd never trust anyone enough to build something serious again, she told me. Watching her choose this, choose you, choose the uncertainty that comes with it, has been genuinely wonderful to witness. She seems more herself than I've seen her in years. I got to see Sable handle real pressure again about 8 months into our marriage, when a client deadline collided disastrously with a multi-day haul neither of us had planned around properly. I watched her manage the crisis with the same calm, resourceful competence she'd shown that first week on the road, working from increasingly creative locations, a truck stop diner, a rest area picnic table, once memorably from the cab itself while I drove, delivering a project on time despite conditions that would have derailed most people entirely. You're terrifyingly resourceful under pressure, I told her, once the deadline had passed and the client had been thrilled with the final result. I've spent a year learning how to make chaos work for me instead of against me. Turns out that's a transferable skill, whether the chaos is a broken laptop charger or a genuine mountain storm. I don't think you know how to do anything halfway anymore. You should see me attempt actually relaxing on a day off. Deeply, embarrassingly halfway on that front. We stopped at that same truck stop diner on our way out of town after the wedding, still in our formal clothes, considerably overdressed for the greasy vinyl booths, and the staff, who'd apparently watched our relationship develop over years of regular visits, comped our meal as a wedding gift, laughing at the sight of a bride and groom eating truck stop pancakes in full wedding attire. Best diner in the country, Sable declared, toasting with her water glass. I'll fight anyone who disagrees. High praise for a place with genuinely terrible coffee. The coffee's terrible. The memories are excellent. I've made my peace with that particular contradiction. I think back sometimes to that first joke over diner coffee. The specific, easy carelessness with which I'd tossed out an invitation I hadn't fully expected her to accept. 6 years of careful almost, and it took a half-serious question and one sleepless night for either of us to finally close the distance we'd both apparently been circling the entire time. Do you ever regret it? Sable asked me once, a few years into our marriage, both of us settled into the specific, comfortable rhythm of a life built around her freelance schedule and my continued hauls, now considerably more frequently shared than solo. The whole thing starting with a joke instead of something more deliberate? Never once. I think the joke gave both of us an escape hatch neither of us actually needed, which meant when you showed up at dawn, it was because you genuinely wanted to, not because either of us had backed the other into some kind of formal commitment. That felt more honest than a deliberate, planned invitation ever could have. That's a very generous read of your own cowardice. I contain multitudes. Occasionally, one of them involves reframing cowardice as strategic honesty after the fact. She laughed at that. The same easy, unguarded sound I'd first fallen for somewhere around hour 4 of that original drive, and reached for my hand the same way she had in that roadside motel room, years earlier, when a storm and a broken brake line had finally forced two people toward the truth they'd both been circling since a diner booth 6 years before either of us found the nerve to say it out loud. What would you have done if a half-serious joke turned into the truest invitation of your entire life? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.